Captain Sarah Mitchell had always been different from other women of her time. While most girls her age were learning to cook and sew, Sarah was fixing airplane engines in her father's hangar. Her father, a former military pilot, had taught her everything about flying when she was just 12 years old. By the time she turned 25, Sarah had logged more flight hours than pilots twice her age. The year was 1943, and the world was at war. Sarah had joined the Military Aviation Corps as one of the first female combat pilots in her country's history. Many of the male pilots doubted her abilities at first, but Sarah quickly proved herself during training missions. She could perform barrel rolls, emergency landings, and high-speed maneuvers that left even experienced pilots amazed. On a cold morning in October, Sarah received an urgent message from her commanding officer. General Thompson, one of the most important military leaders, had been shot down behind enemy lines during a reconnaissance mission. His plane had crashed in hostile territory, and he was trapped in a forest surrounded by enemy forces. The general carried vital intelligence about upcoming military operations that could not fall into enemy hands. Several rescue attempts had already failed. 3 different pilots had tried to reach the general, but enemy fighter planes had forced them to turn back. The area was heavily guarded, and enemy aircraft patrolled the skies constantly. The mission seemed impossible, but time was running out. The general had been missing for 2 days, and intelligence reports suggested enemy troops were closing in on his location. Sarah volunteered immediately when she heard about the situation. Her commanding officer hesitated, knowing how dangerous the mission would be. The enemy had advanced fighter planes and experienced pilots who knew the terrain well. But Sarah was determined to save the general and protect the important information he carried. As Sarah prepared for the rescue mission, she studied maps of the enemy territory carefully. She memorized every mountain, river, and forest in the area where the general had crashed. The weather forecast showed storms approaching, which would make flying even more dangerous. However, Sarah realized the bad weather might also provide cover from enemy fighters. She chose her fastest and most agile aircraft for the mission. The plane was equipped with extra fuel tanks for the long journey and had modifications that made it harder for enemy radar to detect. Sarah also carried emergency medical supplies in case the general was injured, along with additional ammunition for protection during the rescue. Before takeoff, Sarah wrote a letter to her family, not knowing if she would return. She sealed it and gave it to her best friend, asking her to deliver it only if something went wrong. Taking a deep breath, Sarah climbed into her cockpit as the sun began to rise. The engine roared to life and she taxied down the runway, knowing that the most challenging mission of her life was about to begin. Other pilots watched from the ground as Sarah's plane disappeared into the cloudy sky. Everyone knew the odds were against her, but they also knew that if anyone could complete this impossible mission, it would be Sarah Mitchell. Her reputation for quick thinking and exceptional flying skills had earned respect throughout the military base. As Sarah flew toward enemy territory, she thought about the general waiting for rescue and the countless lives that depended on the intelligence he carried. She adjusted her flight path to avoid known enemy positions and prepared herself for the battle that lay ahead. The radio crackled with static as she left friendly airspace, and Sarah knew she was now truly on her own in hostile skies. As Sarah crossed into enemy territory, her hands gripped the controls tightly. The landscape below had changed from friendly farmlands to dark forests and rocky mountains. She flew low to avoid enemy radar, weaving between valleys and using the natural terrain as cover. The clouds were getting thicker and Sarah could feel her plane being buffeted by strong winds. Suddenly, her radio picked up enemy communications. She could hear enemy pilots coordinating patrol routes in their foreign language. Sarah had studied their language during training, and she understood enough to know they were actively searching for any rescue attempts. 3 enemy squadrons were patrolling different sectors of the forest where General Thompson was hiding. Through breaks in the clouds, Sarah spotted the wreckage of the general's plane in a small clearing surrounded by dense trees. Smoke was still rising from the crash site, which meant the general might still be alive nearby. However, landing would be extremely difficult because the clearing was barely large enough for her aircraft, and tall trees surrounded it on all sides. As Sarah circled the area at high altitude, she noticed movement in the forest. Enemy ground troops were moving through the trees in organized search patterns, getting closer to the crash site with each passing hour. She estimated they would reach the general's location within 6 hours if no one intervened. The situation was becoming more desperate by the minute. Sarah made a crucial decision to attempt a dangerous landing technique she had only practiced a few times before. She would have to approach the clearing at a steep angle, using the trees to help slow her aircraft, then land on the very short strip of flat ground. If she miscalculated by even a few feet, her plane would crash into the trees and the rescue mission would fail. Preparing for the descent, Sarah noticed something alarming on her instruments. 3 enemy fighter planes were approaching her location from the east. They had somehow detected her presence and were closing in fast. These were experienced enemy pilots flying advanced aircraft that were faster and more heavily armed than her plane. Sarah knew she could not outrun the enemy fighters in a straight chase. Instead, she would have to use her superior knowledge of aerobatics and the challenging terrain to her advantage. She dove toward the mountains, using the rocky peaks and narrow canyons to break the line of sight with her pursuers. The enemy pilots followed, but they seemed less comfortable flying in such dangerous terrain. Flying at extremely low altitude through a winding canyon, Sarah performed a series of sharp turns that would test any pilot's skills. The canyon walls were so close she could almost touch them with her wingtips. Behind her, the enemy fighters struggled to match her precise maneuvering. One of them scraped his wing against a rock outcropping and was forced to pull up and retreat. The remaining 2 enemy planes continued their pursuit as Sarah emerged from the canyon system. She climbed rapidly toward a thick bank of storm clouds, hoping to lose them in the poor visibility. Lightning flashed around her aircraft as she entered the storm, and rain began pelting her windscreen. The conditions were extremely dangerous, but Sarah maintained control while her pursuers hesitated to follow her into the severe weather. Inside the storm clouds, Sarah changed course completely and headed back toward the general's location from a different direction. She hoped the enemy pilots would assume she had retreated and would not expect her to return so quickly. The storm provided perfect cover, but it also made navigation much more difficult. Sarah had to rely on her instruments and memory of the terrain below. When she finally broke free from the clouds, Sarah found herself directly above the crash site. The enemy ground troops were still about 2 miles away, giving her a narrow window of opportunity. She could see a figure waving from the edge of the clearing, confirming that General Thompson was alive and waiting for rescue. Now came the most dangerous part of her mission, landing in an impossible location while enemy forces closed in from all directions. Sarah began her descent toward the tiny clearing, knowing she would have only one chance to land safely. The space between the trees was so narrow that her wingtips would have less than 10 feet of clearance on each side. She reduced her speed as much as possible, while maintaining enough lift to control the aircraft. The wind was gusting unpredictably, making the approach even more treacherous. As she lined up for the landing, Sarah saw General Thompson clearly for the first time. He was standing at the far end of the clearing, waving both arms to guide her in. His uniform was torn and dirty, and he appeared to be favoring his left leg, suggesting he had been injured in the crash. Despite his condition, the general was actively clearing small debris from Sarah's intended landing path. The first touch of her wheels on the ground sent a jolt through the aircraft. Sarah immediately applied maximum braking while keeping the plane straight and centered. The clearing was even shorter than it had appeared from above, and she could see the wall of trees rushing toward her at alarming speed. With only yards to spare, her plane came to a complete stop just feet from the tree line. General Thompson limped quickly toward the aircraft as Sarah kept the engine running. Time was critical because the sound of her landing would certainly alert nearby enemy patrols to their exact location. The general carried a waterproof case containing the vital intelligence documents, and he moved as fast as his injured leg would allow. Sarah helped the general climb into the passenger seat behind her cockpit. His leg was indeed injured with a deep cut from the crash, but he insisted he could manage the flight. She gave him a quick safety briefing while scanning the surrounding forest for signs of approaching enemy troops. In the distance, she could hear voices shouting in the enemy language and the sound of vehicles approaching through the trees. Taking off would be even more dangerous than landing because Sarah would have to accelerate from a complete stop on the short runway while avoiding the tall trees at the far end. She pushed the throttle to maximum power and released the brakes. The plane lurched forward, gaining speed quickly but not fast enough for the limited space available. Halfway down the clearing, Sarah realized they were not going to clear the trees with a normal takeoff. She made a split-second decision to attempt a technique she had only seen performed by stunt pilots. As they approached the trees, she pulled back hard on the controls and pushed the engine beyond its normal limits. The plane shot upward at an extremely steep angle, barely clearing the treetops with inches to spare. The sudden climb put tremendous stress on the aircraft, and Sarah could hear the engine straining under the extreme conditions. Warning lights flashed on her instrument panel, but she maintained the steep ascent until they were safely above the forest canopy. Behind them, enemy soldiers emerged from the trees just moments after their dramatic departure. As they gained altitude, General Thompson shared crucial information about enemy positions he had observed while hiding in the forest. He had seen large concentrations of troops and equipment being moved to positions that were not known to their military intelligence. This information would be vital for planning upcoming operations and could save thousands of lives. Sarah was relieved that the rescue had been successful, but she knew their troubles were far from over. They still had to fly through enemy airspace to reach friendly territory, and the engine was showing signs of damage from the extreme takeoff. Oil pressure was dropping and the engine temperature was running higher than normal. She estimated they had perhaps 30 minutes of flight time before mechanical failure became a serious risk. Worse yet, Sarah's radio picked up urgent enemy communications indicating that fighter squadrons were being scrambled to intercept them. The enemy had triangulated their position based on radio reports from the ground troops who had witnessed their escape. At least 6 enemy aircraft were being directed toward their flight path, and Sarah's damaged plane would not be able to outrun them in its current condition. Flying at maximum speed toward friendly territory, Sarah studied her options carefully. The engine could fail at any moment, and enemy fighters would soon be closing in from multiple directions. She needed to find a way to evade the interceptors while nursing her damaged aircraft home. The general's intelligence was too important to lose, and failure was not an option. The first enemy fighters appeared on the horizon just 15 minutes after Sarah's dramatic takeoff. She counted 4 aircraft approaching from the northeast, flying in tight formation and closing the distance rapidly. Her damaged engine was losing power steadily, making it impossible to outrun the faster enemy planes in a direct chase. Sarah decided to use the mountainous terrain to her advantage once again. She dove toward a series of deep valleys and narrow gorges that cut through the landscape like a maze. The enemy pilots would have difficulty maintaining their formation advantage in such confined spaces, and Sarah's superior knowledge of low-altitude flying might give her the edge she needed. As they descended into the first valley, General Thompson gripped his seat tightly. The rocky walls flashed past their wingtips at incredible speed, and Sarah was flying closer to the terrain than seemed humanly possible. She knew every twist and turn in these mountains from studying reconnaissance photographs, and she used this knowledge to stay ahead of her pursuers. The enemy fighters followed them into the valley system, but they were clearly uncomfortable with such dangerous flying conditions. One pilot pulled up after nearly colliding with a stone outcropping, choosing safety over the pursuit. The remaining 3 continued chasing Sarah's plane, but they had fallen behind and were struggling to match her precise maneuvering through the treacherous terrain. Sarah led her pursuers through a particularly narrow canyon where the walls were, barely wider than her aircraft's wingspan. The enemy pilots hesitated at the entrance, giving Sarah precious seconds to extend her lead. However, her engine chose that moment to begin misfiring, sending shudders through the entire aircraft and reducing their speed significantly. Oil was now streaming from the engine compartment, leaving a visible trail that the enemy pilots could easily follow. Sarah realized she needed a completely different strategy, because her mechanical problems were getting worse by the minute. The engine temperature gauge showed dangerous levels and she could smell burning oil in the cockpit. At that moment, Sarah remembered something from her training about enemy fighter tactics. These pilots were experienced, but they followed predictable patterns when pursuing damaged aircraft. They would expect her to fly directly toward friendly territory by the shortest route possible. Instead, Sarah made a bold decision to fly deeper into enemy airspace, toward an area where the enemy would never expect a rescue mission to venture. She changed course dramatically, heading southeast toward a region of dense forests and swampland that both sides generally avoided due to its difficult terrain and poor landing sites. The enemy pilots were confused by this unexpected maneuver and split up to cover multiple possible escape routes. This division of their forces was exactly what Sarah had hoped to achieve. Flying over the swampland, Sarah found the air currents she was looking for. The warm, humid conditions created thermals that lifted her aircraft higher without requiring additional engine power. She was essentially gliding on rising air while her damaged engine ran at reduced power, buying precious time before complete mechanical failure. General Thompson, understanding Sarah's strategy, used his radio to send false position reports that would confuse enemy intercept efforts. He transmitted brief messages suggesting they were flying northwest toward a different border crossing, when in fact they were heading due south toward an unexpected route home. The deception worked perfectly. Sarah could see the enemy fighters spreading out across the northern valleys, searching for an aircraft that was no longer there. Meanwhile, she continued flying southeast, using the natural air currents to maintain altitude despite her failing engine. The swampland below provided perfect camouflage, as her aircraft blended in with the dark water and vegetation. However, Sarah knew this was only a temporary solution. Eventually, she would have to turn toward friendly territory, and the enemy would realize they had been deceived. When that happened, fresh squadrons of fighters would be scrambled to intercept them along the actual border. She needed one more clever trick to complete the mission successfully. As they approached the southern edge of the swampland, Sarah spotted something that gave her an idea for the final phase of their escape. A massive thunderstorm was building along the border region, with towering clouds and lightning visible from miles away. The storm system was moving in the same direction they needed to travel, and it could provide perfect cover for the last leg of their journey home. Sarah pointed her struggling aircraft toward the massive thunderstorm that dominated the southern horizon. The storm system stretched for miles in every direction, with lightning bolts illuminating the dark clouds from within. Flying into such severe weather would be extremely dangerous, especially with a damaged engine, but it was their best chance to avoid the enemy fighters that were still searching for them. As they approached the storm, the turbulence became intense. The aircraft was tossed around like a toy, and General Thompson had to brace himself against the violent movements. Sarah fought to maintain control as powerful wind currents tried to flip the plane over. Rain began hammering against the windscreen so hard that visibility dropped to almost zero. Inside the storm clouds, Sarah flew completely on instruments. The compass spun wildly due to electrical interference from the lightning, and her radio filled with static. She had to rely on her internal sense of direction and years of training to maintain their course toward friendly territory. The engine continued to lose power, and she could feel the aircraft becoming harder to control with each passing minute. Lightning struck nearby several times, illuminating the interior of the cockpit with brilliant flashes. The electrical activity was so intense that some of the aircraft's instruments stopped working completely. Sarah now had to estimate their altitude and speed, based on the feel of the controls and the sound of the wind. It was like flying blind through one of nature's most violent phenomena. General Thompson proved his worth as a passenger by helping Sarah navigate through the storm. Using his military training and weather observation, he called out wind direction changes and warned her about particularly severe turbulence ahead. Together, they worked as a team to keep the damaged aircraft flying through conditions that would challenge even the most experienced pilots. After what felt like hours, but was actually only 20 minutes, they finally emerged from the eastern edge of the storm. Sarah was exhausted from fighting the controls and her aircraft was barely holding together. However, she could see familiar landmarks in the distance that indicated they were now flying over friendly territory. The border was behind them, and safety was within reach. But their troubles were not over yet. The engine finally gave up completely, leaving them gliding silently through the sky with no power. Sarah had to find a place to land immediately, or they would crash in the wilderness far from any help. She scanned the landscape below, looking for anything that might serve as an emergency landing strip. In the distance, Sarah spotted what appeared to be an abandoned airfield left over from earlier in the war. The runways looked overgrown and damaged, but it was their only option. She adjusted their glide path toward the old airfield, calculating whether they had enough altitude to reach it. The mathematics were close, and there would be no second chances. As they approached the abandoned runway, Sarah realized it was in worse condition than it had appeared from above. Large sections of concrete were missing, and vegetation had grown through cracks in the pavement. However, there was one strip that looked marginally usable if she could land precisely in the right spot. General Thompson prepared for a rough landing by securing all loose equipment and bracing himself in his seat. He trusted Sarah's piloting skills completely, having witnessed her extraordinary abilities throughout their harrowing journey. Even with a dead engine and a damaged aircraft, he felt confident that she would somehow get them down safely. Sarah lined up for the final approach to the abandoned runway. Without engine power, she had to judge the descent perfectly. Too steep and they would crash hard into the ground. Too shallow and they would undershoot the runway and hit the trees. She adjusted the control surfaces carefully, using every technique she had learned about powerless flight. The touchdown was rougher than any landing Sarah had ever made, but the aircraft stayed in one piece. They bounced twice on the broken concrete before rolling to a stop in a cloud of dust and debris. For a moment, both occupants sat in stunned silence, hardly believing they had survived the incredible journey from deep behind enemy lines to safety. General Thompson was the first to speak, thanking Sarah for the most remarkable rescue mission he had ever experienced. The intelligence documents were intact, and the information he had gathered would prove invaluable to military planners. But more importantly, both of them were alive and back in friendly territory after what many would consider an impossible mission. Within hours of their emergency landing, a rescue team arrived at the abandoned airfield to collect Sarah and General Thompson. Word of the successful mission had already reached military headquarters, and senior commanders were amazed that anyone had managed to penetrate so deeply into enemy territory and return alive. The intelligence that General Thompson carried proved to be even more valuable than originally expected. The documents revealed major enemy troop movements and supply routes that military planners had not detected through other means. This information allowed friendly forces to adjust their strategies and avoid several planned enemy ambushes. Historians would later estimate that Sarah's rescue mission saved thousands of lives by preventing surprise attacks that could have devastated entire military units. Sarah underwent a thorough medical examination and debriefing session after her return to base. The stress of the mission had taken its toll, but she was physically unharmed and mentally sharp. Military intelligence officers were particularly interested in her observations about enemy fighter tactics and the terrain features she had used to evade pursuit. Her insights would be valuable for training future pilots in survival and evasion techniques. The story of Sarah's incredible rescue mission spread quickly throughout the military, inspiring other pilots and ground personnel. Many male pilots who had initially doubted her abilities now regarded her as one of the finest aviators they had ever known. Her innovative use of terrain, weather, and psychological warfare against enemy fighters became required study material at the Military Aviation Academy. General Thompson personally recommended Sarah for the highest military decorations available to pilots. In his official report, he described her as demonstrating courage, skill, and resourcefulness far beyond what could reasonably be expected from any pilot, regardless of experience level. He credited her quick thinking and unconventional tactics with making the mission possible when traditional approaches had failed. Several weeks later, Sarah received word that she was being promoted to major and given command of a special operations flight unit. This elite squadron would be responsible for the most dangerous and important missions, including deep reconnaissance flights and rescue operations behind enemy lines. Sarah was the first woman ever chosen to lead such a unit, breaking another barrier in military aviation. The aircraft Sarah had flown during the rescue mission was examined by maintenance crews and engineers. They were astonished that the plane had continued flying, despite suffering damage that should have caused immediate mechanical failure. The engine had been pushed far beyond its design limits during the emergency takeoff, and several critical components had failed during the flight. The fact that Sarah had managed to keep the aircraft airborne was considered nearly miraculous. Sarah's story became legendary within the aviation community, and she was invited to speak at military academies and pilot training schools. She emphasized that success in dangerous situations came from thorough preparation, creative thinking, and never giving up when faced with seemingly impossible challenges. Young pilots, both male and female, looked up to her as proof that skill and determination mattered more than traditional expectations. Years after the war ended, Sarah continued her aviation career as a test pilot and instructor. She helped develop new aircraft designs and training programs that incorporated lessons learned from her wartime experiences. Her influence on military aviation extended far beyond her famous rescue mission, as she contributed to advances in aircraft design, pilot training, and emergency procedures. The rescue of General Thompson became one of the most celebrated military missions of the war, studied by historians and military strategists for decades afterward. Sarah's combination of technical skill, tactical innovation, and personal courage had achieved what many considered impossible. She had proven that determined individuals could overcome overwhelming odds through intelligence, creativity, and exceptional flying ability. General Thompson remained grateful to Sarah for the rest of his life, and they maintained a friendship long after the war ended. He often said that her rescue had given him the opportunity to contribute to the war effort in ways that extended far beyond that single mission. The intelligence he carried home helped shape military strategy for months afterward, potentially changing the course of the entire conflict. Sarah Mitchell's name became synonymous with courage and excellence in aviation. Her story inspired countless young women to pursue careers in flying and showed the world that gender was no barrier to achieving extraordinary things. The fearless female pilot who had outsmarted enemy fighters and rescued a general became a symbol of what was possible when skill, determination, and bravery came together in the face of impossible odds.